Thanks so much. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with others who are interested in continuing this journey that we're all on. After all, learning is our work, as it is the work of our students. So today we'll be talking about constructing the comprehension house, a blueprint and tools provided. And you can see I have a house here created actually by my grandson to represent some of the critical contributors to comprehension that we will be addressing today. So I do want to begin by saying this to all of you. I want to honor what you all bring to this session today, all the learning that you've been doing, all the experiences that you have. So honor what we all know and do, but also be thinking about what we have to continue to do as well as what we have to change. And so I recognize, having worked in schools for a number of years, that change is difficult, and sometimes changing course is just a few degrees at a time. So when we have our conversation today, I want you to be thinking about where are the leverage points for perhaps creating some change that's necessary, or where the leverage points for affirming what it is that you've been doing and is effective for all of your students. So we'll be focusing on, as Hugh Katz says, creating the conditions for comprehension. He very much advocates for doing this and reminds us that teaching comprehension, just teaching a skill per se, is not necessarily the answer. We have to think about all of the skills, processes, and knowledge base that's necessary for comprehension. So it's up to us to create those conditions. We've provided you with two handouts for today. One contains most of the slides that I'll be talking about, and the other one is a participant guide. So I'll reference that from time to time, but I would just encourage you to use that so that you have an opportunity to engage in our conversation today. So our focus for today, of course, will be the complexity of constructing comprehension, and then a blueprint and tools for informed instruction. So I'm going to begin by talking about the complexity of constructing comprehension, because I think when we begin to consider how to design and deliver effective instruction, it's very critical for us to have a why, to have a rationale, to turn to the science, and have the science inform what it is that we're doing in terms of instruction. So the why, the complexity of comprehension, the what, the blueprint, and tools for informed instruction. So here's the first opportunity to use that participant guide and to be thinking a little bit about the knowledge that you've brought today in terms of comprehension. So let's get the mental Velcro up so that as we have conversation, you can make connection and be thinking a little bit about, what does this make you think about? What are a few words that come to mind? And this is an opportunity, as I've just said, to take a look at that participant guide and perhaps to jot down just a few words about the complexity. All right. One of the ways that I think we can begin to understand the complexity of comprehension is by turning, of course, to the science, turning to the research, and looking for those descriptions that capture the multidimensional aspect of comprehension. And Ann Castles and her colleagues, I believe, has done this beautifully in an article on reading itself. Let's take a moment and have you read this silently as I read it to you. Reading comprehension is not a single entity that can be explained by a unified cognitive model. Instead, it is the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes operating on text and interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. So let's examine this description of reading comprehension a bit more closely. What does it mean when we say it's complex, right? Where is the evidence for that? Well, we certainly can turn to the work of individuals like Kate Nation, who reminds us that as skilled readers, when we come to text and make meaning, it feels pretty effortless, right? Unless it's a particularly challenging text. And so this sense of ease is misleading because it doesn't have us consider the complexity. It doesn't have us delve into everything that we need to access, all right, and apply in order to make meaning. So if we take a look at theoretical models, then we begin to get a better sense, perhaps, of this complexity. And I know many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the simple view, right, which identifies two major factors in terms of reading comprehension: word recognition and language comprehension. And what you see here on the left, in fact, is an elaboration of that simple view recently published by Hoover and Tunmer. Note the word recognition aspect, but our focus for the most part today is the language comprehension aspect of reading comprehension, that factor that plays in. Take a moment and recognize that not only have these authors defined linguistic knowledge, surfacing for us these different systems of language that play into language comprehension, phonological, syntactic, and semantic knowledge, but also the importance of background knowledge and inferencing skills. This begins to give us a sense of this complexity. We can also take a look at the reading systems framework, Perfetti and Strafora. They identify two major sources of knowledge that we use in terms of reading proficiency: the orthographic system, which has everything to do with word recognition, but also contributes to comprehension. We have to be able to read the words if, in fact, we're reading by eye. Some of our students, though, are reading by ear until they have that competency in place. The other source of knowledge is the linguistic system. So here come those systems of language once again, right? And we see that they have gone a little further in terms of identifying some of the comprehension processes that play in terms of reading comprehension. By the way, those processes, according to the work of Kane and Oakhill, very often are the stumbling blocks for our poor comprehenders. I also want to point out how they highlight the role of lexicon right there in the middle and sort of the bridge between word recognition and comprehension processes. So I think there's little doubt that when we talk about reading comprehension, not a single entity and quite complex, and we need to be thinking about different theoretical models as we think about what is it that goes into this building or this construction of meaning. Now let's take a look at the second aspect of this description. Instead, it is the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes. Wonder what those are. Let's see whether or not the literature can surface those for us as well. We'll do a quick check here. And again, you have a kind of abbreviated chart, I think, on your participant guide, and you might want to just jot down some notes or examples as we have this conversation. So comprehension products, well, they're the indicators of what the reader knows and understands after reading is completed. Here's the reality. In classrooms, very often, our focus is on the product. It's on the outcome. In other words, we look at the ways that students can demonstrate understanding, and that demonstration is, in fact, a product. Just consider, for instance, in the classroom, when we ask our students to respond orally, perhaps when they're younger, or in writing as they move through the grades, to varied questions that we pose about different texts that they're reading. Beginning with Antonio in first grade, listening to Stand Tall, Molly Llewellyn. What was her grandmother's message, right? And Antonio's understanding of that is evidenced in his oral response. So a demonstration, an outcome, a product of understanding. Many processes go into his ability to do that. Or if we look at Jermaine in sixth grade, responding to an informational text from Common Lit, the founding of American democracy. Why did the founding fathers have to compromise? Again, this is an outcome or a demonstration of learning. We also might consider standards. And I know, for instance, if you're from Oregon, all right, your second grade standards ask whether or not students can ask or answer questions about who, what, when, where, in order to demonstrate this understanding. And of course, from other places, we have the use of Common Core standards or particular state standards that align with this. So products have everything to do with what is it that we're asking our students to do in order to demonstrate learning. Of course, the ultimate goal or product of comprehension is this overall understanding of learning. It's called a mental model in the literature, and it's foundational. It's the big ideas, the critical understandings that we want our students taking away. You know, our students don't always remember verbatim, word by word, everything that they read, but they should be learning from what it is that they're reading. Right. All right, the second part of this description had to do with processes. So what are we talking about when we talk about processes? Well, we're talking about the cognitive and language activities by which the reader arrives at these products. We don't get products unless we have processes, and high quality processes lead to high quality products. We can think about varied ways of thinking of this in our day-to-day experience, but in terms of reading comprehension, we can be quite specific. So let's look at some examples that are quite specific. This is the work of O'Kill and Kane, who have done a great deal of work in the area of reading comprehension, including thinking through where is it that students might have difficulty. And so they talk about language processing at different levels. Take a moment and read this to yourself. So I'm thinking perhaps as you're reading, you're making connections to instructional components. We have to have the vocabulary. We need to be able to make sense of the sentences, sentence comprehension, right? We need to be able to see how sentences work in combination with one another. So we integrate meaning between sentences. We need to use our background knowledge. And yes, very often that background knowledge has to do with the specific domains that we're addressing in our text. But by the way, a specialized type of background knowledge is text structure. And I want you to keep that in mind. And we're doing all of this so that we understand not only what's explicit in the text, but also what's implicit. So language is an important component from early on, oral language being the base, and then our responsibility to continue to develop our students' oral language while also helping them to translate what they have in place into written language, the written language of text. All right. So as I was talking about this, I'm thinking no doubt you probably were thinking about the reading room, because doesn't it correlate beautifully here? And when we think about, again, these processing skills, the knowledge base that our students needs to bring based in language, we can turn to the reading rope, which identifies these two bundles, all right, that work in concert with one another, all right, and each of the strands working interdependently as well. And so our focus again being on language comprehension. So bringing their background knowledge, bringing their vocabulary, language structures defined by Hollis Scarbo, this is our beautiful reading rope we know, as a knowledge of semantics and syntax, those structures, verbal reasoning defined as a metaphor and inference, and then of course literacy, print, and knowledge, this knowledge of genre, well, beginning with print concept and then going to genre that our students bring. So working on developing over time in concert with one another so that students not only can read word, all right, but also make meaning. There it is, Hollis Scarborough. All right. So at this point, you might be saying, why are you spending so much time talking to me about product and process, right? And there are instructional implications here that we need to be thinking about. So if we think a bit about Walter Kinch's work, a very well-known theorist in terms of reading comprehension, the construction integration theory, for instance, we can talk about the fact that the distinction between process and product implies for teachers that we have to think about their effect on the product, all right? And that our intervention and instructional approaches then have to not only affect the student's product, but we have to go a little deeper and think about what are the processes necessary, what are the skills, the knowledge base necessary in order to produce the product. So Ken Diao, in a study of students who were struggling, said this: when a child is repeatedly unsuccessful in comprehending texts that he or she has read, this suggests reading difficulties at the processing level. These difficulties can manifest themselves in various ways: failure to recall the main points of a story, failure to answer literal and/or inferential questions, failure to complete the actual reading of the text, and so on. So the implication here is we need sometimes to go deeper than just thinking about whether or not they responded correctly to whatever our question, query, or task might be, but thinking about what were the processes, what were the skills, what were the knowledge that needed to be in place in order for them to produce that product. All right, the last part of this description that we'll be working on and thinking about today. All right, so you might have been saying to yourself, wow, this is interesting, but what happened to the reader? You haven't talked a whole lot about the reader or the text. And of course, the RAND Reading Study Group report, their heuristic deals specifically with this operating on text, interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, purpose and goals of the situation. And they've represented this in this infographic, all right? They call it a heuristic, by the way, a model that calls to mind the fact that there's this wonderful dynamic relationship between the reader, the text, the task, and the context, right? So we're going to think a little bit more about that before we leave this particular topic. So I've created my own infographic to help us better understand this, to kind of pull this all together and think not only about this interaction that's occurring, but these language processes and skills, as well as the cognitive processing that's necessary to deal with different levels of understanding within the text. And I've represented the reader in the upper right-hand corner. And of course, what is she doing? She's reading a placard about dinosaurs. She's in the museum and she's going to, as we see on the left, the text that she'll be working with is the text that she's going to find in the museum on dinosaurs. But of course, it could be any number of different texts that we would represent here, such as the ones that we showed on that products page when we began. So the reader comes to the text, and what does the reader bring? They have to bring their knowledge of word meaning, all right? And of course, sometimes the text is quite challenging in terms of vocabulary and word meaning, because texts, for the most part, age and grade appropriate, all right? Authentic texts are written in academic language. Disciplinary texts written in academic language. So they have to deal with academic vocabulary. So they have to bring their knowledge of words, their breadth, words they recognize. Oftentimes the context helps them with their meaning of depth, words they own. And then the use of precise words. We know that words can be very nuanced. Just think about a whole range of synonyms that we use sometimes for different words. They also have to work with the sentences that they find within the text. And sentences, academic language, can be very dense, many, many ideas, idea units, propositions they're called. They can be very long, taxing working memory. Different structures, simple, compound, complex. Compound, complex convey different types of ideas, right? And then we have to think about that tying up of meaning within and between sentences, and that's accomplished through the use of cohesive ties and connectives. More on that later, all right? They also have to bring their knowledge, right? Their schema, something specific to the domain. I mentioned text knowledge, and they're using that for what? For inference. You cannot infer without background knowledge. And overall, what we want for them to be able to do is create a coherent representation of text. Sorry, that's not showing up here. It does when it's not in this mode. All right. And what does that mean? That the ideas all hang together in a meaningful way so that the student can walk away with this overall understanding. Of course, I do have a task represented through assignment. So dependent upon the task, will determine the intensity in which they have to examine the text. We know that text can be quite difficult in terms of vocabulary, syntactic structure, genre, and so on. So important to keep all of that in mind, text complexity, as well as what it is that the student brings to the text. Now, this is a lot so far, I know, so take a deep breath, right? And take in what it is that you can, connect to what's most meaningful for you. You might be saying, wow, you've talked about processing, you talked about product, but I heard you talk a lot about language. What about cognitive processing? And so here's an overlay that helps us better understand some of what has to happen in the mind of the reader, right, as they're working with the language of the text, right? And this is based on Judith Irwin's work. So microprocessing occurs, finding and pulling out the idea units. That's happening at what we call the surface code of the text, using the exact words and sentences that the author has provided. Integrative processes have to occur. in which they're going from sentence to sentence and they're building meaning and seeing how these ideas connect. Metacognitive thinking occurs. That monitoring of understanding. Is this making sense at multiple levels of understanding? And then elaborative processing is also happening because of the incorporation of background knowledge in order to go below the surface of the text to get something that's called the text base. And then finally, macro processing is occurring because, again, that overall goal that I talked about, we want our student to be able to do what? We want them to be able to form a mental model, an overall representation of text that makes sense. So when we read the literature about comprehension, the literature speaks to working at the surface code with the exact words and syntax provided by the author, working at the text base. The author gives us some ideas explicitly, but there's always some ideas implied within the text. So that's the text base. And then ultimately being able to, in a very dynamic way, all right, this interaction, reader, text, task, purpose, all right, in a dynamic way to arrive at this overall understanding of the text, the situation, or the mental model. So, mental model, ultimate goal of reading. Let's keep this in mind. Let's take a moment again for you to read this script. So this formation of this mental model, this kind of overall understanding of text is occurring not step by step, but in kind of a simultaneous way. There's an aggregation of successive units of meaning that's occurring. And what's important to keep in mind is that language and cognitive processes are playing a major role here in terms of creating the ultimate product. And we can have different types of products. This is what I would consider and what the literature considers the ultimate product. So it's the overall understanding of the situation expressed in the text. The reader stores this in memory and hopefully accesses it for future application. I want you all to keep this in mind because I know we get very focused on strategies and skills, and certainly those are useful tools in terms of comprehension. But what is our purpose really for reading and teaching our students how to read well? It's so that they will learn, so that they will come away with content, knowledge, or ideas that they can use for future application. So reading proficiency is not just about the development of skill, it's also about acquiring knowledge. Okay. All right. So I began by calling your attention to the participant guide and saying to you, what came to mind when you thought about the complexity of comprehension? Why don't you just take a moment and jot down a few other words maybe now that come to mind, having had this discussion, or perhaps some words that you had forgotten about and that you want to bring forward again. So constructing comprehension is complex because. All right. So let me move you on then to the second focus for today. And it is, of course, the blueprint and tools for informed instruction. So you may recall at the very beginning, I said, we're going to start with the why. Really, science needs to be informing what it is that we do in terms of instruction. And so the blueprint is directly informed by the complexity of comprehension and reflects much of what I've just shared with you, but of course there's much more, right? So we'll be talking about constructing this comprehension house and using a blueprint to do so, along with some tools that we'll be sharing today. So based on the science, all right, I'm posing a question again. What could a blueprint for comprehension instruction include? So I've given this a great deal of thought over the last several years. And for those of you who know my work, you may know, perhaps not, that this work really began for me as a national trainer for letters. I'm one of the original letters trainers. And thinking through what comprehension was really all about, and working directly with Louisa Moats on the second edition of the module on comprehension, right? And from that work, I began to work with other educators, teachers, continued my own learning, because learning is a journey for all of us, and ultimately arrived at what I call a blueprint for reading comprehension instruction. And it continues to evolve, this work, but I'm going to share it as it is currently. So first of all, what is it? All right. So I want you to know that, and you have in your participant guide a copy of the blueprint, all right? But I want you to know that it's not a lesson plan or a lesson organizer. It's a framework. It's a master plan that considers both product and process demands, perhaps with a little bit more emphasis on process, because my sense is that we've really been very focused on product, and we don't get product without process in place. It's meant to organize and scaffold the teacher's preparation of text for varied purposes, right? And it certainly does call for the use of, in case you were getting worried and thinking, well, where are the strategies, right? It does call for the use of evidence-informed strategies and activities for both process and product, but very focused, thinking through, all right, if I need to develop vocabulary, what do those strategies and activities look like? If I need to develop sentence and comprehension, what do those strategies and activities look like? And so on. It allows for flexibility. Some of our students need more of or less than, all right? And some texts demand more or less than, all right? So thinking through our context, thinking through our students, thinking through our text, we can be flexible in terms of our emphasis, all right? And of course, it acknowledges the metacognitive nature of teaching, because what are we all always doing in terms of our own teaching? We're always asking ourselves questions. Okay, so here's the blueprint. And again, you can find this in your facilitator guide, along with this brief description that I just provided for you. Let me tell you a little bit about the format, and then we'll dig a little bit more deeply into some of the components, all right? What you see on the left-hand side is preparing for instruction and then text reading. And this is really the what of the blueprint. What will we focus on? And as you begin to look at this very first part, the critical understandings of text and purpose, has everything to do with what do we want our students learning, right? And then text reading has to do with specifically what are those contributors, all right? And how will they contribute to, how will we directly address them in terms of the text that we're working with? So when you take a look at this, you're probably thinking, oh, that looks a little bit like the reading rope. And yes, it does. Levels of language processing, vocabulary, language structures, knowledge, levels of understanding, including inference, and then expression of understanding. When you look at the right-hand column, what you see are the questions that we need to pose to ourselves as we think about the strategies and activities that we need to use in order to develop these critical competencies. And again, these come from the science, they come from the literature. So the questions I've crafted are my questions. They're a direct reflection of what it is that the literature tells us in terms of each one of these contributors, and how we might go about addressing them instructionally. All right. So if we're going to build a comprehension house, we're going to consider what? Critical understandings. You see that as foundation. Comprehension monitoring, which I'll talk about in a moment, being very important. Major pillars of instruction, vocabulary and background knowledge. And then, of course, the additional framework which is necessary, including sentence comprehension, text structures, and these different levels of understanding, all culminating in what? This ability to comprehend, to make meaning of what it is that we're reading, culminating in the building of a quite strong comprehension house. So let's now delve into a little bit about the preparation aspect that I just talked about, right? So as you prepare for designing and delivering instruction, what do you consider about the conditions? Remember, you cats talked about those conditions that support understanding. And I want to suggest to you that one of the things, regardless of curricula, regardless of the materials that you're using, is that we need to begin to think about what are the critical understandings that we want our students to acquire. After all, reading comprehension is about acquiring knowledge. It's about learning. What's our purpose for reading? What kinds of goals and objectives do we need to have? And then what about the readings that will best support the development of these competencies that we want in place for our students. So here on the right-hand side, you actually see the questions that appear in the blueprint, which were in that right-hand column. So take a moment and just read those to yourself. All right, let's delve a little bit more deeply into some of these. So one of the things that I proposed is that when we think about prep for learning, that we think about what are the big ideas? What is it that we want our students to take away? So here we have a description of critical understandings, or the big ideas. They're the important understandings that we want students to get inside of and retain after they've forgotten many of the details. Enduring understandings go beyond discrete facts or skills. They focus on larger concepts, principles, or processes. And so some of the curricula that's out there have identified these. Sometimes teachers work within topical or themed units, or sometimes teachers come together and identify these big ideas and then work on curricula that will support. All right. An example of this might be that stories teach us many lessons, right? And in the younger grades, that's a big idea. We might be using fables, right? Another big idea might be something like animals can also teach us lessons. And a book like The One and Only Ivan might be an example. Or that change requires many different perspectives. And an article on the American Revolution and the different perspectives of the different colonies might be important. So there are varied ways we can think about big ideas. And again, some curricula identify, and sometimes teachers do this on their own. The second part of this has to do with purpose, all right? In addition to creating these critical ideas, content, right? We also need to be thinking about what are the literacy skills that we want to develop within our students, right? So I think Tim Shanahan really makes this point well. He says, we're very focused on reading skill as strategy, but sometimes we lose out on this opportunity to expand children's understanding of their world. And so he says, reading lessons need double outcomes: an improvement in reading ability and an increased knowledge about whatever was read. So the blueprint has both content, goals, and objectives, and literacy skills and objectives. And again, I would encourage all of us to be thinking about that a bit more, right? In terms of choosing purposeful readings, I've just given you just a brief example of an enduring understanding or a particular reading. But I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that texts have different purposes. So our decodable and our level texts certainly can be used as a basis for comprehension, but those texts are not going to convey necessarily the academic language or provide the opportunity for the development of academic language and knowledge that's so necessary for comprehension. So we need to be thinking about the use of age and grade appropriate text, whether we're listening by ear, reading by ear, or reading by eye. And Marilyn Adams makes this point for beginning readers, certainly, in which she talks about the fact that certainly we want to provide texts in which students can develop their word recognition skills, but we also want to provide them with opportunities to develop the language knowledge, literary appreciation, and mode that makes reading productive and rewarding. And Tim Shanahan also speaks to this. There's little excuse for not using reading materials that expose children to classical literature or to rich content. And we know now that there is very much a push in terms of using informational texts, science texts, social studies texts, so that our students are developing knowledge as well as skill. Just because it's a reading lesson, there's no reason that the content of the text one is practicing reading with can't be rich in information, all right? So 2 things to consider. What are those critical understandings, all right? And then secondly, our purpose for reading, which is connected to that, all right, content and literacy skill goals and objectives, and the texts that go along with and support. And again, thinking through what you currently use, what you might enhance, would probably be helpful. So here's a bit of a self-reflection in terms of thinking about how one chooses texts or even texts that are in place. And I'll give you a moment to just self-reflect and read these questions about the choice of purposeful text. So take a moment and read through. So I'm sure if many of you are familiar with thinking about these different aspects. It's just important that we continue to think about the fact that even as we're developing word recognition skills in struggling readers, they need to have access to text that contains academic language and that develops the knowledge base that will be necessary for them to create those mental models of text as they move throughout the grades. We also want to be certain that their texts they see themselves in their texts, and so they can identify themselves, their experiences, that the texts are culturally responsive, and once again, access issues. So if they need to read by ear, they read by ear until they can read by eye. Age and grade appropriate texts. Okay. All right. So that's the first part of the blueprint, that preparing forth, kind of thinking through where are we at with our curricula, where are we at with our programs. Are there some enhancements? Are we right on? What might we want to keep in place? What might we want to small degrees, degree by degree, make changes? Second aspect of the blueprint, then, what critical aspects of instruction do you consider in designing and delivering? So we're getting ready here, but now we need to get ready to not only prepare our thinking, but also to do something with it, right? So here we're talking about these critical competencies, instructional approaches, including strategies and activities. And so here, that left-hand side of the blueprint, which we introduced, and I said, here's the what, which aligns very much with the reading rope: vocabulary, sentence comprehension, background knowledge, text structures, levels of understanding, expression of understanding. Now, you might have noticed that there was a bidirectional arrow that kind of separated out these components from the questions. And I do want to point out that bidirectional arrow means that, when we think about instruction, we can think about, as a teacher, as an educator, as a specialist, as an interventionist, whatever our role might be, that we play a role in making decisions about and being flexible about before, during, and after instructional strategies and activities, when and where these things occur. We also need to be thinking about comprehension monitoring, right? So we know that the before, during, and after activities, a flexible approach need to be explicit, structured, systematic, and scaffolded. And I know that you're all familiar with the work of Anita Archer. And we need to be thinking about, are we talking about whole group, small group, or individual instruction? And many of the strategies and activities that we use in whole group are appropriate for our students who are struggling, but we need to be thinking about how perhaps we differentiate or become more intensive or even more explicit in terms of our approach with these students, scaffolding their learning. Of course, we're going to be using evidence-based instructional routines, strategies, and activities throughout. And I already pointed that out at the right-hand column of the blueprint, which surfaces questions about how to go about designing and delivering instruction, are based in the literature. But what about that comprehension monitoring piece? It seems like we overlook this quite a bit, and I just want to take a moment to remind us that this is something that we need to embed throughout our instruction. So oftentimes when we think about comprehension monitoring, what immediately comes to mind is a fix-up strategy or a reread, all right? And I think we need to be a little bit more specific about this. I think we need to ask ourselves and teach our students to ask themselves, why are they not understanding the text? Does it have something to do with word meaning? Does it have something to do, and of course you wouldn't say to them linguistic devices, but I would talk about sentences and sentence comprehension and the ways in which we connect up meaning within and between sentences. Does it have something to do with the knowledge base, all right? The topic, the domains that are being addressed? Does it have something to do with holding on to and attending to the information and how we might help them parse Does it have something to do with engagement? Do they see themselves in the text? Are they interested in the text? Do they feel capable of working with the text? Okay. So when we talk about fix-up strategies, I think it's important that we think about this in a broad way. The rereading, the use of independent word learning strategies. Students, when they come to vocabulary, we can't teach them all of the words. So teaching them how to use a dictionary, how to use morphology, how to use the context. Is it about searching for clues and annotating? For instance, for those connections within and between sentences, the use of cohesive ties? Or do they need to look up or ask for additional information to make connections? And then keeping them engaged by giving them tasks that engage them, summarizing, questioning, visualizing. And that gives us then also kind of a way in to see where is it that they're struggling. Okay, all right. So you might be saying, oh, finally, she's getting to the contents of the comprehension house. All right, so here it is. And we're going to talk now a little bit about constructing the comprehension house. And I'm going to focus on just two aspects of this because in the remaining time, that's all I really can do. Right? So I'm going to focus on text reading, vocabulary, and then language structures, phrases, clauses, sentence, comprehension. And the two are connected. Recall that both of these are the surface code of the text, that the exact words and syntactic structures that the author provides us with. So I'm going to talk about this from a semantics syntactical point of view, because if you recall, on the reading rope, all right, we have vocabulary, and then we have language structures that have everything to do with syntax and semantics. And I want us all to be thinking about the fact that when skilled readers come to the text, they recognize and retrieve the meaning of individual words and work out the syntactic structure and sense of the sentence. So here's a quick lexicon check. Again, you can use your participant guide and you can be thinking very quickly about how do you define semantics? What does this mean, this semantic syntax connection? How does it relate to these critical components? And of course, semantics has everything to do with our knowledge of word meanings, phrases and sentences, and their relationships. All right. And we'll focus for a moment here on word meaning, but we're going to get to phrases and sentences. So a reminder about how important words are, right? That they're not just words, they're the nexus. They communicate thought for us. And when we read, we build, refine, and modify our knowledge base because of these words. So what makes words valuable and important, not the words themselves as much as the understandings they afford. And in fact, words are the beginnings of knowledge networks, aren't they? All right, because when we think about words, right, we acquire meaning bit by bit. We make connections to other words. So they're multidimensional in nature. So incremental, multidimensional, and they're interconnected. All right, they have semantic relationships with other words as well. So the beginning of knowledge networks. What does the blueprint ask us to consider in terms of vocabulary? Well, it says, which words will your students need to know or worth knowing, right? So you have to make decisions about this as you choose texts and as you work with texts. Which ones will you intentionally target and directly teach? Which ones will you incidentally on purpose teach, how and when? So not only are we responsible for directly teaching the words that our students encounter in text, all right, but there are always words in text that we cannot address and words that surround them that we need to be thinking about incidentally on purpose teaching to them. So developing through oral, very often oral language experiences, but also through a reading of text. How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? That's that dictionary, morphology, context, independent use, all right, of those strategies to figure out, to infer the meanings of words. And then which words will you purposefully discuss and incorporate into expressive language activities? Because your students need to be using these words for them to own the words. All right. So this framework, which I provided for you, is reflective of those questions. All right. And the framework is, again, based in the literature. It represents 4 pillars of instruction: intentional instruction, incidental on purpose instruction, intentional independent word learning strategies, and then kind of flowing throughout word consciousness, purposeful activities that allow for our students to really get interested in word meaning. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about each of these today. I don't have the time to do that, but I do want to highlight for you, just for a moment or two here, intentional instruction. So when you come to text and you have to make good decisions, sometimes the curriculum makes those decisions for you, but you should always be thinking about your students and what it is that your students are bringing to the text, and being certain that the words that you are choosing to focus on are useful, they carry understanding in terms of the text itself, and allow for some growth on the part of your students. Remember, word meanings bit by bit, knowledge networks. Considering principles of instruction. Research tells us we need to provide definition and context for students, and basic routines for the introduction of vocabulary. Provide the definition, provide the context, and then allow for additional examples. And those instructional routines then are based in, first of all, providing just that. And then secondly, thinking through additional opportunities for your students to process and engage with the words. So you need to go beyond just the definition and the context. If in fact, when you directly teach words, you want your students to own words, they need to engage in processing and practice activities. These should align with their semantic relationships, so making connections to other words that are similar or a part of a knowledge network. There should be an opportunity to represent words, whether you do that visually, through gestures, through word wall, or use of words, expressive use, and that means both speaking and writing. All right, so this then becomes a framework, and if you're interested in more information on this, you certainly can email me. All right. Let's now go to syntax, all right? So take a moment again in your participant guide, because we want to make this connection between semantics and syntax, language structures. What comes to mind when you think about syntax? And I'm hoping as you thought about this, you were thinking about the order and organization of words, phrases, and clauses to convey meaning through different types of sentences. This has everything to do with the internal order of the sentence. The way in which the words are placed within the sentence conveys the meaning. It's a clue to the meaning, and semantics and syntax go hand in hand. So let's go a little bit further with this. So syntax often is considered a vehicle for conveying meaning. When we ask our students to work with sentences, to understand sentences, they have to extract the meaning of these interconnected sets of propositions. Those are ideas. They have to deal with how the idea units, all right? And you might be thinking subject and predicate. I think who and do, all right? How the who and the do connect. This depends upon what? The semantics, the word meanings, right? And how those words are placed within the sentence, the syntax. So syntax explicitly conveys information about how the word meanings should be integrated into an idea or a proposition, so that the reader does not have to infer who did what to whom, right? So I want us all thinking now about syntax or grammar. I mean, they're not quite the same, but all right, we can think about them in a similar way. I want us to be thinking about this from the perspective of not form, all right, but function, how their function conveys meaning. So the building blocks of meaning for a sentence includes parts of speech, and typically we think about form. Parts of speech are, and we have definitions that go along with, and those are wonderful. But what does that have to do with their actual job within the sentence? How do they contribute to meaning? Phrase types, same thing. What's their job within the sentence? How do they convey the meaning? What questions do they answer? Who did what to whom, when, where, how, and why? What parts of speech or phrases or even clauses do that? And the same thing with sentences. So thinking about the fact that syntax provides the structure, semantics provides the words and phrases that convey the meaning, and they're placed within the sentence in a specific way to convey that meaning. All right. Right. Everyone start thinking now about how they typically think of sentences. So I'm guessing some of you thought, well, a sentence conveys a complete thought. Yes, it does. I bet some of you thought about, sentences have subjects and predicates. Yes, they do. Did you think about a sentence this way? An abstract linguistic frame that has slots for categories of words and phrases. Oh my. I can think about that word flower, and I can think about the fact that dependent upon where I put that within the syntax of the sentence, it will have different meaning. So different categories of words and phrases will convey different meaning, and the syntax provides its support. The flower is beautiful, an idea flowered in my mind. So it's a language frame, and I think it's important to think about it that way, that uses these different categories of words, yes, parts of speech, phrases, clauses, and so on, to convey meaning. And where they're placed, that internal order has everything to do with how they convey the meaning. So a sentence is a vehicle for conveying idea units. Now, one of the things that happens with academic language, and this is important for all of us to consider, is that sentences can be quite compound, complex, and even simple sentences, not so simple. So Cheryl Scott and Catherine Balthazar speak to us about the fact that when we use age and grade appropriate text, when we use authentic text, disciplinary text with our students, all right, these texts contain academic language. This is not our spoken language, our everyday language, right? And when we examine these texts, we find that some of the sentences are very long. We have to go digging for the who and the do. Some of the sentences have more than one who and do, lots of idea units. Some of the sentences have what we call these embeddings, which are modifiers on multiple phrases or clauses. Sometimes there's a long distance between the who and the do, long distances between the critical elements, or there's subordination. Think about complex sentences. And sometimes sentences are not all written in active voice, but passive voice. And this is particularly difficult for the comprehender. One of the things we know about poor comprehenders is they have difficulty with this integration of meaning within and between sentences. So let's just look at a few sentences to further convey this thinking, to support this thinking. These come from different texts that can be used at varied grade levels, all right? Just choose one for a moment, read it to yourself, and be thinking about how complex and how complicated the sentence is in terms of structure. So just take a moment with me and let's look at that very last sentence, which is probably around a 6th or 7th grade informational text from Common Lit, The Founding of American Democracy. And did you notice the founding fathers? Well, I know what the who is, all right? Where's the do? Because in between the who and the do here, right, we have this description, our group of men who were key figures in initiating America's independence from. And what did they actually do? Oh, I'm getting to the do now. They established American government and early international relations. So as our students are called upon to work with these texts, and by the way, they need to be introduced to these early on through read alouds, all right? Even children's literature, all right, contain sentences that are this complex. We need to get them thinking through and helping them by modeling the parsing of these sentences. But we also need to be thinking about where do we start? What are the basics that we need to put in place in order to work with sentence comprehension, in order to work with the sentences that we're finding within these texts. One of the things that comes to mind as we think about this is the fact that, and this is Richard Zippely's work, many reading programs tend to underemphasize explicit instruction aimed at enhancing students' knowledge of sentence structures. So guess what? Here's an underemphasized part of reading comprehension that we probably need to be thinking about. How do we use what we're currently working with in order to enhance our students' understanding of? And I couldn't help but put this other quote in because I love Cheryl Scott's work. The sentence lies at the heart of communicating thought and meaning. Whether you are the reader or the writer, or the writer or the reader, the rules of our language, syntax, and grammar allow for the creation of an infinite number of sentences that serve as the worker bees. So we have to figure out how to teach our students how to work with the worker bees, one by one, adding up to the gist. So here are some general guidelines that I think are helpful in terms of thinking about sentence comprehension. And again, this is the work of Richard Zippoli. So I know many of you are working with our at-risk students, our struggling students. And of course, he's a speech and language pathologist, and he's writing about those students who oftentimes have language issues, all right, language impairments that are struggling with sentences. And here's some guidelines he provides, right? That we need to work in both oral and written modality. So asking our students, all right, to speak in those complete sentences, asking them to respond, produce a product in those complete sentences, providing them with prompts if necessary, and then moving to the written modality. So providing models orally and then written. He's also talking about the integrating of reading and writing, not two silos of instruction, but making connections between, all right, teaching our students how to write a sentence or sentences, paragraphs, for instance, making those connections between that focus and instruction and reading comprehension. And then thinking about some of this explicit instruction that needs to occur in terms of different sentence structures, phrases, clauses, and so on, and providing opportunities within the curriculum themselves. So these are not isolated drill and skill. This is using the text itself, right? So I'm very much about all of those critical contributors that I've talked about on the left-hand side of the blueprint. We use our text to work with and to teach our students how to develop the processes, skills, and knowledge necessary. All right, so what does the blueprint ask? Okay, so those were general guidelines. Well, the blueprint says, are there parts of speech, phrases, clauses, sentence structures that may be difficult for your students? So you're examining your text. How and when will you directly teach sentence comprehension? How and when will you teach students to work with these structures? And how will you facilitate the integration of ideas, the use of cohesive ideas and connectives? How and when will you teach students to work with these? So a focus on those building blocks, all right? Getting back to basics and then building with your students, but always using your text as your base. So parts of speech, phrase types, clause types, working with sentences. So I'm going to share now in the remaining time, very cognizant of time, just a few examples. All right, this is the toolbox, much as you had a framework, all right, for instruction for vocabulary. Here's the toolbox, okay, for sentence comprehension. And you have this in your facilitator guide. Notice here, I've talked about, or I've indicated both intentional as well as incidental on purpose instruction. Our focus right now will be on grammar-based deconstruction activities using the text, sentence-based activities, and then cohesive devices. So one of the activities I wanted to share with you is an activity that I call words working together, all right? And this has everything to do with taking words that are within the text that you're working with and having students begin to think about what their function is, how they contribute to meaning, all right? So in order to do this, they have to understand the role of parts of speech in constructing meaning or sentences, all right? Our materials will be some sample word cards, and then we'll use a structured question organizer. You'll see that in a moment. The teacher will select a sentence, could be from any one of the texts you're using. Here it happens to be that founding of American democracy. The teacher then would model and review response to structured questions. You'll see those in a moment. And the teacher distributes then to the student cards with individual words from the current text, copies of that question organizer, and they work in pairs or small groups and use the word cards to find answers to the questions. Now, a prerequisite is understanding that parts of speech, all right, have a function and they answer questions, right? Take a moment, choose one or two of these, and think about what question does that particular part of speech answer? Everyone have one in mind? Okay. Yeah, pronouns answer who, what, or whose. And there's an example from The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy, she. Nouns answer who or what, mummy. Verbs answer is or was doing. This word found can be found in that selection. Adjectives answer the question which one, how many, what kind, such as the word powerful. Adverbs generally answer when, where, how, and why. There's an example, finally. Prepositions convey relationships between words before and after, above is one, and conjunctions, what's connected or glued together. So here's the activity. You need to understand those questions and the parts of speech that answer, because those are the clues that will then help you work with these words. So here's the words for it. All right. There are words that come directly from the founding of American democracy. And we're asking our students, after we model, to work in pairs and to do the sort. And what might their responses look like? Who or what? Rights, democracy, colonists. Is or was doing, solved, disagreed, interprets. Which one, what kind, how many? Central, each, presidential. When, where, how, carefully, again, equally, and so on. By the way, this activity could be used for phrases as well, or the selection of words that you use could be words that eventually would form sentences, and that's an anagram activity. All right. Another thing that we can do is think about using questioning, all right, in order for our students to understand the meaning of phrases, right? And I know oftentimes we think about a phrase from the perspective of the prepositional phrase, but we have to be thinking about the fact that there are a group of words that work together and answer specific questions. And in the left-hand column, you see some of the questions that, in fact, they can answer. So not unlike parts of speech, a noun phrase answers the question who or what. A verb phrase answers the question is or was doing, happening, and so on. And there are adjectival, adverbial, prepositional phrases, and we can teach our students to work with these phrases and respond to questions such as, find, excuse me, is someone unmuted? Yeah. Can you find a phrase that, all right, answers the question who or what? Oh, how about the road? Can you find a phrase that answers the question which one, what kind, how many? How about ragged and forlorn? Can you find a phrase that answers the question when, where, or how? Oh, how about rather abruptly, and so on. So working with the words of the text, all right, working with the meaning conveyed by individual words and then by phrases and even clauses, we can get our students thinking about how grammar, how syntax contributes to meaning. We also want our students working at the sentence level, don't we? So there are multiple things that we can do with our students at the sentence level. One of these would be sentence combining. I already mentioned anagrams in which we take individual words, such as those words from the founding of American democracy, put them on separate cards, and have our students work to form sentences and have conversation around the different sentences they can form with the words. All right. But sentence combining has everything to do with taking sentences from the text. Sometimes we modify them a bit. All right. And we have our students work with them in terms of combining based on different types of combinations in a very logical sequence. So beginning with combining sentences by looking for adjectives and adverbs that we can combine. How would you describe the ant from the ant and the grasshopper? Well, two sentences we're providing our students with. The ant collected stores for the winter. The ant was industrious. How about the industrious ant collected stores for the winter? And the most advanced type of sentence combining, dealing with relative clauses which are later developing. How would you describe Stalin? All right, this is from Stalin, a Brutal Legacy, also common lit. Stalin was ruthless and ruled through fear. He executed hundreds of thousands of his countrymen and committed multiple atrocities against his people. So here we have the industrious ant collected stores for the winter. Here we have, there's the relative clause, Stalin, who was ruthless and ruled through fear, and so on. So this is really the work of Bruce Sadler, and he's done a great deal of work in terms of sentence combining. And so he's created a sequence that you see there on the left-hand side. All right, in the middle, you see some of the sentences that I've created from different text examples, questions and sentences. And then you see some of the combined results. And I've seen this done beautifully as a warm-up, for instance, for sentence comprehension. It gives students also an opportunity to write, all right? So the use of written expression combined with thinking through these oral combinations, all right? Last but not least, I want to talk about cohesive device activities, and then maybe we'll just have a few minutes for questions. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier is the student needs to be able to access the meaning of words. They have to work with the syntactic structure. They also have to integrate the meaning within and between sentences. And in fact, all right, the way in which we do this is through something called cohesive ties or connectives. And this will make sense to you in a moment. These are syntactic and semantic elements that bridge and integrate information within and between sentences. In fact, this is called a type of inference, local coherence inference. You can store that for a future time. All right. So what are cohesive ties? Oh, pronoun reference, substitution synonyms, repetition or ellipsis. Very often what an author will do, or even you as the writer will do, is you don't use the same words over and over again. You might use a pronoun referent, all right? A pronoun to refer to a word found in the text. For instance, look at that first example about Thomas Jefferson, and look at the way in which the author has substituted in the word he for Thomas Jefferson. Ever ask your students questions about who's the he, and would they know it's Thomas Jefferson? In the second one, the author replaces a word or group of words in the text. Oh, great man. Who's the great man? Oh, I guess it's Thomas Jefferson. And sometimes there's a repetition. So here we see Thomas Jefferson repeated with the word Jefferson. And then sometimes the author leaves words out, but the clue can be found in another part of the text. Jefferson owned slaves who he considered what? Well, we see it in the very last sentence in the example above, property. All right. So cohesive ties are used frequently in writing to integrate meaning, all right, within text. They take their meaning from another part of the sentence. Here's an instructional routine that allows for the identification. We identify the targeted words, such as Thomas Jefferson. We frame a question or task. We search for clues, and then we can make the connections visually or verbally. All right, so for pronoun reference, for instance, you might underline. For substitution synonyms, you might draw connecting arrows. And I'll give you a quick example here. This is the mystery of the tattooed mummy, all right? The focus here, the targeted word is 20-something woman, all right? The question has to do with, can you find the pronouns that are standing in for or referring to? Or the question might be, can you find the synonyms or substitutions or groups of words, all right, that the author is using instead of 20-something woman? And because of our time, I'll just go very quickly here. Here are the pronoun reference underlined, she, her, her. And again, I'd be asking my students the questions, who's she? Who's her? Do you know it's the 20-something woman? And even more importantly, all right, in terms of synonym substitutions, right, do you understand that the 20-something woman is actually the queen, the high priestess, the warrior princess, the mochi VIP, and the most elite figure? All right. So connecting up these ideas within and between sentences is quite important. And so yes, basics, but then moving to the integration of idea propositions, right? And we saw that in the cognitive processes. And then last but not least, the connectives are conjunctions, which I'm not going to spend time on because I'm going to leave just a few minutes for questions. But just know that oftentimes these connectives, right, these conjunctions, sometimes they're adverbs, signal logical relationships between parts of speech. They cue up specific types of relationships. And we need to teach our students for both writing and reading comprehension the meanings of additive, temporal, causal, adversative, conditional conjunctions, right? And then, of course, here are some examples. And again, using the text, we can pull out and model for our students and then have conversation about what does finally mean? Oh, that has to do with time. What does but mean? Oh, there's some condition here, and so on. All right, last but not least, there's the blueprint. This was chock full of information. I'm hoping that you've pulled something out that was important for you. All right. And we discussed then vocabulary and language structures, but there's much more. And keep in mind that this is an integrative process, not just within and between sentences, but the text itself that builds over time so that we have a mental model. So I'm hoping I affirmed something for you, that you can acknowledge something perhaps that was new or different, and maybe some action that you want to take. And last but not least, I just want to convey how much I appreciate all of you being here today, your participation and your commitment to learning to your students. So I'll ask now whether or not there are any questions that we might want to pose or think about. And my facilitators will, I think, bring those forward for me.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Nancy. I, for one, definitely always learn something new from listening to you, and I really value and appreciate your time spent with us as well. There is a question in the chat that I can read into the space, and then if there's anyone else that wants to chime in, they could, or enter it in the chat. So, question is, and it's a little long. Are there special considerations that we should keep in mind using this blueprint when working with kids who have hyperlexia or dyslexia? I'm also thinking of kids that have deep knowledge and expertise in special interest areas, but may have less knowledge than their peers in other areas. So, e.g., the student who loves everything about planetary sciences, but maybe has trouble with fiction about a dog.
Yeah. Okay, well, a couple of things. In terms of the student who's dyslexic, those of you who know my background, I'm a past president of the International Dyslexia Association. And so I was a decoding queen until I really began to delve much more deeply into comprehension. Oftentimes, our students with dyslexia have good language. And we need to continue to build on that and make certain that they have access to age and grade appropriate text so that they continue to build that. At some point in my life, I was a special educator as well, resource room teacher, and worked with middle school students who were dyslexic, who really didn't have language difficulty, but kept losing out because they weren't being exposed to or have access to what was appropriate for them, what their peers were learning. They were getting further and further behind. So that's the dyslexic student. The hyperlexic student, the student who has perhaps language impairment, because oftentimes when we talk about what are the predictors for, difficulty with reading comprehension, well, the predictors have everything to do with language, right? And Hugh Katz and his colleagues have done some research in this area. And so, thinking through our screening measures that may or may not include indicators of language skill, language attainment, vocabulary, ability to work with syntactical structures, grammatical awareness. We need to be aware of those students so early on we provide the intervention that's necessary for them. And then thirdly, in terms of the student who has specific interests, I love attending to those specific interests, but I think we also need to be thinking grade by grade, organizationally, what are the big ideas? What are the enduring understandings? So collectively, we're developing knowledge around those, while also providing some opportunity for our students to pursue their interests. And one of the things that I indicated in the incidental on purpose instructional column for vocabulary was, that independent reading. That's so important for our students, and they can be doing that by ear or by eye.
Thank you. Another question is, can we find your visuals and charts used in your PowerPoint, I believe, in your book?
Yes, everything that, yes. So, it's funny, the book really came out of training. It came out of a blueprint training. And so people kept saying, where's the book? And I thought, oh, I'm going to write a book? Oh, no, I can't write a book. And eventually I did write the book, obviously. So yes, these visuals are contained within the book, and there are templates in the book and downloadables in the book as well. Thank you for asking that. But certainly I've sent you, in your participant guide, you have certainly some of these, and in the PowerPoint slides.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I think that is all that I'm seeing here, and we're actually right on that perfect timing moment. So well done, Nancy.
Well done, everybody, for being here. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Love having an opportunity to share, and just wish we could have more interaction. But if you want to email me with ideas or questions, more than welcome. They would be more than welcome. So thank you for this opportunity, and thanks for facilitating today for me.